Hey there. Yeah, hi. Excuse me. Have you ever had these gummy bears with the sugar substitute? What would you rate them out of 5?
1 star. Just don't. Unless it's a gift for someone you hate.
Well, that is a reaction. What happened to you, man?
Words cannot describe what happened to me after reading these. The Gummy Bear Cleanse. If you are someone that can tolerate the sugar substitute, enjoy. If you, however, are like the dozens of people that tried my order, run. First of all, per taste, I would rate these a 5. So good. Soft, true to taste fruit flavors like the sugar variety. I was a happy camper. But, or should I say, but. Not long after eating about 20 of these, all hell broke loose. I had a gastrointestinal experience like nothing I've ever imagined. Cramps, sweating, bloating beyond my worst nightmare. I've had food poisoning from some bad shellfish, and that was almost a skip in the park compared to what was going on inside me. Then came the flatulence. Heaven to Murgatroyd, the sounds. Like trumpets calling the demons back to hell. The stench, like 1,000 rotten corpses vomited. I couldn't stand to stay in one room for fear of succumbing to my own odors. My own odors.
Well, thanks for sharing. I think I better get
Wait! There's more. What came out of me felt like someone tried to funnel Niagara Falls through a coffee straw. I swear my sphincters were screaming. I felt like my delicate starfish was a gaping maw, projectile vomiting a torrential flood of toxic waste. 100% liquid. Flammable liquid. Napalm. It was actually a bit humorous for a nanosecond because it was just beyond anything I could imagine. And it went on for hours. I felt violated when it was over, which I think might have been sometime in the early morning of the next day. I mean, there was stuff coming out of me that I'd eaten in my wedding back in 2005.
Okay, that's intense. What did you do with the rest?
I had 5 pounds of these innocent-looking, delicious-tasting hell bears. So I told a friend what had happened to me, thinking it had to be some type of sensitivity I had to the sugar substitute. And in spite of my many warnings and graphic descriptions, she decided to take her chances and take them off my hands.
No.
Oh, silly woman. All the same for her. And a phone call from her while she was on the toilet. Because, you kind of end up living in the bathroom for a spell. Saying she wish she would have listened to me. I think she was crying. It gets better. Her sister was skeptical and suspected that we were exaggerating. So, she took them to work because there was still 99% of a 5-pound bag left. She works for a construction company where there are builders, roofers, landscapers, etc., etc., etc. Lots of people who have limited access to a toilet on any given day. I can't imagine where all those men and women pooped that day. I keep picturing men crossing their legs on the roof, trying to decide if they can make it down the ladder in time or if they should just jump. If you order these, best of luck to you. But please don't post a video review during the aftershocks.
Yeah, that is, Ooh, that is, that is something. It is really hard to believe that these gummy bears would be capable of that, but they do look really good, though, and delicious. You know what? I think I'm just gonna take my chances with these ones. You know, I got a party coming up. People are gonna love them. Well, thanks for your steaming review on these. I think I'll take my chances. And, yeah, thanks a lot, friend. Bye-bye. Take it easy.
Best of luck to you, friend. And may God watch over us all.
Wasn't exactly like they was a Lone Star. Yeah, what are you supposed to do? Kill Mufasa?
Precisely.